Oops, I turned on the display for you guys, sorry. Good morning. Okay, excellent. Sorry it's kind of small, but this is the easiest way to share it with the students who are online. So if you can't quite read something, let me know. So we're going to be talking today about the creation of our current Constitution from 1876, the type of government that was created, as well as some of the issues we've had with the amendment process, and so on. So essentially, we're wrapping up Chapter 2 today. So as we're going along, if you have questions, feel free to raise your hand. Anyone who joins us online can use the chat function or the hand raising icon. And if you need something repeated, just let me know. Okay, so we talked last time about the previous constitutions, including the radical Reconstruction Constitution that was basically a failure. So they knew they needed to redo the Constitution. But in 1874, the attempt to do so got through the through the state Senate, but not through the House. And part of that was because it would have given too much control to the elites. So that attempt was pretty much BOA. So in 1876, they decided to hold a state constitution convention. And they elected 90 delegates across the state, many of whom were associated with the Grange, which is a farmers' organization. So there was a heavy presence for agriculture and major industries throughout Texas. Most of the delegates were conservative in nature. They didn't like what they'd seen in the previous Constitution, so they decided to basically limit the government as much as they could. 2-year term for the governor, no ability for minorities to vote, the passage of Jim Crow type laws within the state of Texas. They also created a biannual legislative session, a fixed state salary, and a limited debt ceiling. So because the state government was so restricted, Texans were willing to ratify this Constitution. They said the state won't be able to take advantage of us anymore. We're going to go ahead and approve this Constitution. So our present Constitution was created in 1876, and we have not rewritten it since then. We've just amended it. That's okay. Everybody starts looking at their phone like, wait, did I remember to put it on vibrate? Yeah, I did the same thing. Don't worry about it. Okay. There are 507 amendments in our Constitution. 483 of them were added by 2013. So we're talking a lot of amendments. And part of the problem is we have to pass a new amendment to cancel out an old amendment. So when we passed an amendment banning same-sex marriage, and the Supreme Court overturned that in 2015, we then had to add an amendment to the Constitution saying the previous amendment is no longer valid. So part of it is overturning previous constitutional amendments by passing a new one, saying this amendment's no longer valid. It's a long and not very well organized document. If you ever take a look at it, it's 200 something pages in PDF form. It's pretty difficult to get through. Yeah, it's not light reading. And it's really long because it's extremely detailed. There's a lot of protections for private interests. There's a lot of details about policy and how the government will be organized. So it's very, very wordy. Very, very long Constitution. And despite the fact that it is that long, there's no clear lines of responsibility for our state government. And you would think a Constitution that had 507 amendments in it would clearly outline how our state government is going to work. But it's not that well organized. It's kind of hard to see who's in charge of what, which makes it harder for us to hold our state officials accountable because we don't necessarily know who's in charge of what. For example, you go to one place to get your driver's license, you go to another place for your car registration. In other states, it's in one facility. You know, why should we have it separated, right? Why make it harder on people? And an example of this is the unclear guidelines for how we elect justices of the peace. One constitutional amendment gave Chambers County the ability to have up to justice of the peace precinct. But a third of the county is underwater. So I can't imagine that there needs to be a justice of the peace for the area that's submerged in the coastal water. It's just not very logical. It's not a very logical, clear Constitution. And I'm sorry to say it's not the longest in the nation. You'd think it would be, but we're actually second behind Alabama. The Alabama state constitution is the longest. There's 93,000 words in our Constitution, but it's still second behind Alabama. So we don't even. More amendments? Oh yeah. That 507 is from the most recent election, actually. That includes last November. And yeah, when the state legislature meets in 2021, there may be yet another constitutional amendment election.
There's no limit on
Nope.
how many?
Nope. Nope. Yeah. So for example, Crystal, one of the things the legislature was looking at the last session was legalizing medical marijuana. It didn't pass, but if it does in the next round, it'll have to be voted on. So that could be a constitutional amendment that gets added. Yeah. But yeah, we could end up with something like 800 amendment constitution, easily. That's why it's almost an exercise in futility trying to read the darn thing. Okay, so every state constitution includes a Bill of Rights. every amendment that's in the federal constitution has to be in the state constitution. So every time the federal constitution amended, the state had to add it to our constitution. And that can't be voted on by us because that's federal. So, for example, when they lowered the voting age from 21 to 18, Texas had to write that into the state constitution. So Article 1 of our Constitution does include a pretty similar Bill of Rights, talking about freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, due process. Right, we can't just hang people like we used to with lynchings. We can't deny the press the ability to criticize Governor Abbott. The fundamental rights in the federal constitution are also granted to us in Texas. But like a lot of other states, Texas has tried to somewhat restrict non-citizen immigrants from coming into Texas. There have been issues with cities not wanting immigrants coming in and taking advantage of their services, which is a violation, right? People should be free to live wherever they want, but unfortunately in Texas there's been some issues with attempts to restrict that movement. There is in Texas a very particular emphasis on individual rights, gun ownership, protecting private property. Basically, you mind your business, I'll mind my business, and we leave each other alone. I think it's fair to say that's a pretty common attitude amongst Texans, right? Stay out of my way, let me do my thing. The issue with that, of course, is our gun laws are very, very lax in this state, and law enforcement doesn't necessarily like that. They don't like the fact that anyone you pull over could potentially have a gun on them, right? But because of our emphasis on individual rights, that's not a fight they're going to win necessarily. And of course, we do have to deal with issues of immigration, both legal and illegal. Being in the border area, of course, we've all seen the issues that happen down here with illegal and also legal immigration. And there's a lot of concerns about homeland security. On the one hand, of course, you want to stop illegal immigration. On the other hand, we don't want racial profiling of Hispanic Texans, right? We don't want people being pulled over by the cops on DWB, driving while brown, right? We don't want to see that happening. So there has to be a balance between the need for security, but also protection for the people in Texas. Also for legal immigrants, right? If there's always a suspicion that they're here illegally and they have to carry their documents everywhere, that's a little bit of a burden. So it's an issue that isn't going away anytime soon, but it's one we're going to have to think about, especially because the state is becoming what they call a minority majority state. It's estimated right now that the largest racial group within Texas is Hispanics. So that's going to change a few things, quite possibly. Okay. Any questions, comments? Okay. Any questions online? You can use the hand raising icon or the chat function. Mm-hmm. Some do, yeah. If they don't have something else they have to do, we can't require you to be online during class time because you know, you may have other things or if you have kids at home. If you can't make it to the in-person class, but you can be online, that's fine. Yeah.
Would that, if we show up online, would that count for our attendance?
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I only count attendance for the days you're in class, so only on Wednesdays. But if you can't make it to class, like if you're sick and you go online, that counts for attendance. Yes. Yes. Good question. Thank you. Yeah. And then that's why I'm recording the lectures too, because then if students can't be online during this time, they can go watch the lecture later. Or if you guys.
And if we can't make it, like, if they're scheduled on, 30 days, that they can't make it for 30 days, they can show up to the online.
Yes. Yes. I have had some students who need to swap sections, like a student on Monday switches to a student on Wednesday. That's fine. The only thing is there can't be more than 10 students in a room, so it has to be an equal swap, like 1-to-1. But yeah, if people need to swap, that's fine, just as long as they find someone to switch with them and let me know. Yeah. Okay, any other questions? No? Okay, those are really good questions, by the way, so please, you know. Like our federal constitution, we also have the separation of powers. We have 3 branches of government, executive, legislative, and judicial. So we also have a bit of a balance of powers, checks and balances through impeachment. The governor can be impeached, and it works pretty similar to the federal level. The state house would impeach the official, and then the Senate would vote to remove a governor, a judge on one of the benches, lieutenant governor, and so on. We have had one governor who was impeached and removed in the 1920s. And it does happen in other states as well. For example, I grew up in Illinois, and we had a governor, Rod Blagojevich, who ended up going to jail, actually, because he tried to sell President Obama's Senate seat when he got elected president and got caught on tape. He wasn't a very smart man. But he also had to be impeached by the state legislature. I think he got only 1 vote in opposition. It was pretty much unanimous through the chambers, and then he went to federal prison. So it happens. It's rare, but it happens. So it's a way to make sure the governor or a state judge isn't abusing their power, that they're not trying to do something stupid. And the governor, of course, has the veto power. Like the federal legislative branch, the state can override a veto. But when we talk about the legislative branch, the legislature, I'll explain a little bit more about why that's hard to do. But the governor can veto legislation. And the state Supreme Court, like its federal counterpart, can review state laws, and they can say, you know what, you're in violation of this law, or you're in violation of federal law, so you can't do this. So a recent example is when they were looking at moving the Republican National Convention to Houston, and the city of Houston said, absolutely not, we don't need a massive COVID outbreak here. And the state Supreme Court sided with the city of Houston and said, this is too much of a health issue, we can't have an in-person convention in Houston. All right, so the legislative branch. It is bicameral, meaning in 2 chambers. We've got the state house and the state senate. Their salaries are capped at $7,200 $200 a year. And no, that's not a typo. That's actually what they're making this year as a state legislature, $7,200. They get money when they're in session, but in the off years, that's all they make as a member of the state legislature. So they have to have other jobs or be independently wealthy, or both. Our legislature is unique in that it only meets every 2 years. So it met in the spring of 2019. It will meet again, maybe in person, maybe virtually, in the spring of next year. So they don't meet annually. There's also been no attempt to change that to where it would be an annual session or to increase the salary. So for now, we have a unique legislative branch in terms of salary and operations. The legislature gets some of its power through the fact that they can essentially get the state to try and do what they want, but they have to go through the people. By and large, the amendments that are in our Constitution don't necessarily need to be there. For example, the voters had to add an amendment to allow veterans to purchase land at a very cheap rate to readjust the civilian life. That's a legislative issue, right? It's not really something the voter should have to be asked to pass. That's something the legislature should be able to do. But it's hard because of the process. It's hard for them to just pass straight word legislation. So much of it has to be voted on. So it slows down the legislative process quite a bit. And it makes them take issues to the voters, and the voters may not care. We're lucky to see maybe 10 to 15% voter turnout in a constitutional amendment election. A lot of people don't even realize there's an election, or they don't necessarily care. So it makes it harder because the state legislature is relying on the people, but the people don't necessarily care. And the legislature cannot authorize the state borrowing money. There's a bit of a complicated process with that that we'll speak about more when we talk about the legislature in more detail. The paper proposal, which will be due in a couple of weeks. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep. God, I'm trying to remember. It's due 23rd. Thank you. I thought that was right. I wasn't sure. What I'll do is I'll open an assignment in Blackboard, and you'll just upload your paper proposal there. And I'll post an example so you can see kind of what it should look like. Yeah. And it's not for credit. It's just so I can see that you're not trying to do too much in one paper. Okay. The executive branch, of course, includes both the governor and the lieutenant governor. The lieutenant governor is elected separately in this state. In a lot of states, they run together as a ticket. Here, they don't. And the lieutenant governor presides over the state senate. In a lot of ways, his or her duties do kind of mirror the vice president of the United States. They oversee the state senate. They do kind of the ceremonial work. They help out if the governor is out of state. So they're the two biggest positions within the executive branch. But it is what's called a plural executive. You've got 5 other elected officials serving. You've got the governor, the lieutenant governor, the state controller, the commissioner of the general land office, the state attorney general, and the Texas Railroad Commission. Which again leads to the question, who's in charge, right? Who's in charge of what? How do we know who's responsible for what particular action? Makes accountability, again, a bit harder. You don't know whose fault it is if something goes wrong. So the governor is limited in that sense, because he's sharing the executive branch with a large group of people. He or she's also limited in their ability to rearrange agencies, remove officials, because most positions are elected, not appointed. So the governor can't just walk in and fire people from the previous administration. There has to be special permission to do so. Where the governor does benefit is in the fact that there's no term limits. Governor Abbott could run for another, 12 years if he wanted to. There's no term limits. Their term ends when the voters get rid of them or if they decide to run for higher office. It used to be a 2-year term, and then it became a 4-year term in 1972. Governors need a little bit more time to get things done. 2 years just wasn't quite long enough. The governor has some capacity to remove officials, but again, it's pretty limited. Because the positions are elected rather than appointed, there's really not much he or she can do about that.
You mentioned that the governor has to have permission to remove somebody
Mhm.
from the elected person.
Usually from one of the other parts of the executive branch, sometimes from the state legislature, just depends on the position. And some of them, he just can't remove them because if you have someone working in, let's say, Parks and Wildlife Services, and a new governor comes in and fires everybody from that, well, that's going to be really chaotic and difficult. So they try to limit it so the governor can't just fire people and hire whomever he likes instead. Okay, our state judicial branch is a bit interesting. There's 6 types of courts: municipal, county, district courts, courts of appeal, and we actually have 2 state Supreme Courts. One Supreme Court is for civil matters and one is for criminal. So we're unique in that sense because most states have one Supreme Court that handles both. We have 2. So one branch deals with civil issues, one deals with criminal. And there's a lot of overlapping jurisdiction. Constitutional county courts have concurrent jurisdiction with justice of the peace cases, depending on money. Part of it's going to depend on the amount of money in dispute for civil cases and whether it's a misdemeanor or a felony case. And it can make it difficult to know where your case is going to be heard, which court takes jurisdiction. So if you're ever part of a civil case, especially, pay very close attention to where the trial or the hearing's going to be held. So you don't want to end up in the wrong place on the day. So part of it is based on statute, part of it's because of the way the Constitution has set it up, and the only way we could change this to remove the overlapping jurisdiction is through a state constitutional amendment, which not likely, but not impossible at the same time. At the low-level courts, you do not have to be a lawyer to serve on the bench. A municipal judge can be someone who runs for the office and wins. You don't have to have legal training in a court that deals with traffic tickets and things like that. So for some courts, any of us in the room, if we met the criteria, could run for and become a judge. And a couple of other levels, low-level trial court benches, you don't have to be a lawyer either. Yeah. And we'll talk more about that later, but yeah, it's a unique feature that you don't have to be a lawyer in the, or have legal training in the lower level courts. And we also elect our judges. And of course, there's benefits and drawbacks to that. On the one hand, if we don't like what they're doing, we can vote them out of office. On the other hand, that means they're going to have to pay attention to what the voters want, and they may be feeling the pressure to give someone a really harsh punishment, even though they don't necessarily deserve it. So there's benefits and drawbacks to this particular way of choosing judges. And there's no limit. And also, to be quite blunt about it, most of the voters couldn't tell the judges apart anyway. So you go in on election day and most people are voting based on party. They have no idea who these judges actually are. And another interesting feature of Texas, and not in a good way, is that we do execute the most people of any state in the U.S. And part of that, I think, is because judges are elected. You want to be really hard on defendants, right? So you're going to want the death penalty. You're going to want to be seen as a law and order kind of judge. Okay. We also, of course, have the local government that's been created. And again, we'll go into more detail about this later in the semester, but counties in Texas are under a commission form of government. Basically, there are elected positions that make up the county government, and the commission is headed up by a judge. So there will be someone to represent your part of the city or your city in the county government. So for Hidalgo County, there will be a commissioner for Barr or Edinburgh or Weslaco. And again, they are, the commissions are headed up by a judge. There's also the ability to use what's called home rule. Basically, the legislature will say, you can write your own charter, you can elect your own officials, you can pass whatever laws you need, provide services, as long as it doesn't violate the state constitution or state laws. So for example, Austin can't pass a rule decriminalizing marijuana because that goes against the state constitution. But they can increase the budget for law enforcement or education without needing the legislature's approval. And this is beneficial, of course, to the legislature. If they had to approve every decision made by a city in Texas, they'd never get anything done. So if a city has more than 5,000 people in it, they can apply for home rule, and usually they're going to get it. So cities like Austin, Houston, San Antonio, Dallas, McAllen are all going to have home rule. It's really only the very, very small towns of like 200, 300 people that aren't going to have their own form of government. And there's also what's called a special district. This is a very form of government that has a bit of a restricted purpose. School districts are considered a special district. So the Weslaco school district, that's a special district. They're subject to slightly different rules and regulations. And each special district is going to have its own purpose and its own powers. So water districts, schools, things like that are going to be considered special districts. And school districts are going to have to decide, do we want to build a new school, hire more personnel, things like that. So the voters do have to vote on the constitutional amendments, but there's some restrictions on it. First, we cannot propose a constitutional amendment. Only the legislature can. In other states, voters can circulate a petition, and if they get a certain percentage of registered voters, they can get something on the Constitution, on the ballot. Here, it can only come from the legislature. We cannot directly propose an amendment to the state constitution. It has to come from the legislature. If the legislature wants to approve or introduce an amendment, a 2/3 majority in both chambers is required. So you need 2/3 of representatives and 2/3 of the Senate for it to get introduced to the public. If it meets that threshold, the proposed amendments have to be put in a newspaper once a week in every county 4 weeks prior to the election. So in 2019, there were 10 proposed constitutional amendments. All of them had to be published in a different newspaper once a week in every county for a month. So the voters would know what's on the ballot, what the amendments mean, and be better informed going in to vote. Assuming, of course, that they actually look at that information prior to voting. And for an amendment to pass, it's a simple majority, so basically 51%. So if you hit that magic number, 51%, it gets added to the state constitution. As I mentioned on Monday, in the last election, 10 amendments were proposed, 9 of them were approved. Only one failed, the one to allow municipal judges to serve more than one municipality. Everything else passed.
Did some of them serve two?
No, what they were trying to do was allow it maybe partly it's a money saving kind of thing, because if you have small municipalities, why pay 2 judges when you can pay 1? But the voters didn't want that, so.
So how would they do it nowadays? Not a lot of people read newspapers?
Yeah.
It's a lot of social media now.
Yes, so they still have to publish it in the newspaper, but the information will also be published in the newspapers online. They'll share it through like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, things like that. So on Facebook they'll say, follow our link to read this article and try to reach people that way. Yeah, so it's a very good point, because I can count on one hand the number of people I know who read a newspaper anymore, yeah.
Because we're finding in the household and
Yeah.
online business.
Yeah. Yeah, for the most part, they are sharing it through like Facebook and stuff. I remember seeing an article for one of the newspapers or websites down here, news websites, and like follow this link and you can see it. Yeah. Yeah, so they're trying to do it like that as well. Most of our amendments have been passed since 1980. And a lot of that's just due to changing attitudes, changing beliefs. We pass a law restricting marriage between a man and a woman, but then it has to get overturned. So amendments are added and then we have to replace them. Kind of makes sense that we're going to have a lot of amendments added after 1980. We do have to add amendments based on Supreme Court rulings as well. For example, Roe v. Wade. Right now we have to have it established that women have the right to obtain an abortion in Texas. So part of that's tied to court cases as well. But I agree with you, Johnny. I think they may have to change the process for how they publish the amendments going forward. They may have to update it to say posted on social media and newspapers.
And I think they should update everything, because nowadays, I guess, the generation like us, we read newspapers, but the new generation doesn't read newspapers.
Right.
They're on their social media so much, or everything's online for them.
Yeah, exactly.
Not only that, now due to COVID, everything is being made.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And we don't even know if the next legislative session will be in person. They may do a virtual session because it may not be safe for the lawmakers to gather in Austin. That's going to depend on if we have a vaccine or not by next January, which may not happen. So it could be a very interesting situation for next year. Yeah.
Hopefully we'll be able to do it.
Okay. Our Constitution's a bit outdated, right? I mean, we've got a Constitution that's over 100 years old. We haven't rewritten it. We haven't really revised or overlapped, changed the state constitution. And realistically, our legislature needs to meet annually, not biannually. This is a very large and constantly growing state. It doesn't make sense to have the legislature meet every 2 years as opposed to every year. There's so much that needs to be done that it doesn't make sense to have them every other year. Realistically, they should be meeting every year.
I think so.
Yeah.
Everything. I mean, there's a lot of changes. Like due to this COVID, how many changes have we had?
Exactly.
It started in March.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I would say at least twice a year.
Yeah. And they could do the short sessions like they do, like January to April, and then come back in like September or something to save money. Yeah, because they created a budget in 2019 when the economy was great, and that budget's shot to hell right now because of COVID. So it doesn't help that the state legislature can't meet and be like, okay, we need to revise the budget, let's cut here, add here, you know. Not very practical.
Well, that is, because we went through it, like this unemployment thing. You have to go to the president to with those people who are unemployed,
Mhm.
they could propose something.
Yeah. Yeah,
And it can go up.
exactly.
Because every state has a different salary or
Mhm.
different unemployment rate.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I would say, twice a year.
Yeah.
And when something like this breaks,
Mhm.
yeah.
For
unemployment, no. I think it's in New York, unemployment.
unemployment benefits, is that what you're talking about? We pay the least amount, or are you talking, I think so. We're
okay. It's New York. Well, we can reach up on it a lot.
Okay, yeah. Yeah. The other thing too is, and I'm getting slightly off topic here, but it does relate. The governor can call a special legislative session. I don't understand why he hasn't called one and said, we need to deal with this COVID crisis. Even a virtual one, just say, guys, we need to figure out what we're going to do about health, what we're going to do about unemployment, how we're going to help the Rio Grande Valley when we had that huge uptake. It just escapes me as to why they haven't been doing that. I know it costs the state money, but it's an emergency. Yeah.
It's a crisis.
Yeah.
It costs the state money for them to meet.
Yes. Because they have to pay the legislatures when they're in session, so they have to give them pretty much like a daily stipend to pay for housing, food. They have to pay for the cost of maintaining the buildings when the people are in there.
They could just do it virtually.
They could, yeah. The reason they don't regularly, so constituents can have a chance to meet with the legislature members face to face. Or so that college students can go up to Austin and see it in session and see how the legislature works. Yeah. Yeah. But it may be virtual next year because we may not have enough vaccine doses, even if one gets created by the end of the year, to facilitate a face-to-face discussion. And by the way, it was announced today that the U.S. is not going to compete to create the COVID vaccine. We've decided that we're going to sit on the sidelines for this one. So it's probably going to come out of a European company, in all likelihood.
Because of Russia.
Partly and partly because, and this argument doesn't really make a lot of sense to me, the government's saying that it's not going to be fair. Yeah, it makes no sense to me either. They're trying to say that it's not fair to the United States. Part of the problem is our laws regarding medicine, right? We have proprietary ownership, so we would want other companies to pay higher rates for our vaccine to be distributed, and other countries don't want to pay that higher price, and they don't want to have to pay through the nose to get the vaccine from the U.S. European countries, there's less of that proprietary ownership. They don't charge as much for the vaccine to be distributed.
So are we going to be able to use it because they do something and then the FDIC says,
if it's approved and it works from like a European company, apparently our government has already ordered 800 million doses, which is way too much. They're going to have to cut back on that because there's only 300 million something Americans. But we would order it from the manufacturer. Like, let's say it comes from a company in Germany, then the U.S. would put in an order for, let's say, 350 million doses, and the U.S. government would pay for it. It would be distributed, and then we would pay through insurance or something like that.
So let's say, I know it didn't make sense.
No, that's okay.
Let's say, I got to get classified.
Yeah.
I donate my blood. Well, I can, but, I go get checked and everything, doctors and stuff. I go get blood. So my blood's going to have to travel, my plasma's going to have to travel to Europe?
Possibly, unless your plasma is used to try and help someone who's currently fighting COVID in the United States. Yeah, it could be one or the other. Yeah.
I was listening to the morning, like, you were saying that they're going to stop.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, it might be stored like flash frozen and sent to Europe, or they might, because they're doing some trials here with the plasma from survivors and giving it to people currently fighting it to see if they can help them survive. So yours might go to someone who's in the hospital with a severe case to try and help them survive. Or it might go to Europe. Yeah. Yeah. But either way, thank you. If you do that, it would really be beneficial, I think, if people would do that.
I gotta go check first.
Of course,
but.
but it would be, it is helpful to people who are stepping up and doing that. It is very, very helpful. Okay. Part of the reason we haven't really revised the Constitution is most people kind of like the government as it is. They're like, yeah, we don't have a lot of power. We don't have to spend a lot of money on the legislature. Yeah, things are fine as they are. Let's just leave it as it is. And the other problem is we keep adding amendments to either fix older ones in the state or respond to new federal ones. What we really need to do is do a complete rewrite of the state constitution. Now, of course, that's going to take time and money, but the fact that we have over 500 amendments is kind of ridiculous. We should update it for the 21st century, simplify it, streamline it, make it very clear what the lines of responsibility are, what our rights are. Get it down from 500 amendments to like 50. Right? I mean, that's possible. We could do that. It would certainly make it easier to read the state constitution and to discuss it without getting a headache. Yeah, there's a lot of changes that are necessary that just haven't happened for one reason or another. Okay. There's also, unfortunately, a bit of reality needed to understand that there's a lot of horse trading, backdoor negotiating, interest groups getting their foot in the door with the Constitution that happens. Interest groups will try to use the Constitution and an amendment to benefit from the system. In 1985, there was an amendment added that would give water breaks to small cities, farmers, and ranchers. And of course, that's going to benefit the agricultural interests. And it's easier to amend in a provision than to amend out. So interest groups are going to try to use this to their advantage. Oh, let's write an amendment that will give us an advantage in mining, or agriculture, or oil. So unfortunately, it does open the door for lobbying, possibly illegal bribes, all sorts of trading of favors to get an interest group almost a permanent benefit. We also have an interesting relationship with gambling. There's very few casinos in Texas. I think I know one that was allowed because it's on a Native American reservation and their laws are different than Texas laws. Basically, gambling is pretty much outlawed in the state of Texas, other than the lottery and like one or two casinos. And we didn't have a state lottery until 1991. And state lotteries are really beneficial because the money that gets spent on tickets goes to schools and things like that. So they're actually a moneymaker for the state. But it took the state a while to realize how important that actually is. Another interesting conundrum is that if the state ever wanted to create a state income tax, the legislature would have to approve it, but so would the voters. And it's unlikely that voters are going to say, yeah, I want my income tax twice, right? Federal and state. Most people don't like the state income tax. There's a reason Texas is popular. States with no income tax have seen an increase in the population, and you get to save a little bit more of your money that way. Now, if we did ever pass a state income tax, the way it would work is they would say, okay, you can have a state income tax, But 2/3 of the revenue have to go into decreasing property taxes. The main taxes we have right now are property and sales tax. So if you wanted a state income tax, you'd have to reduce property taxes. It'd have to be an offsetting kind of thing. We've also had financial institutions trying to use the Constitution as well. We had a bit of a mortgage crisis, economic collapse in the late 80s when oil prices tanked again. Banks wanted to be able to get bought out by the bigger banks, so they had to basically propose an amendment to allow branch banking and for homeowners to take out a second mortgage. So that's why you don't really see very many small hometown banks anymore. They've largely been bought out by Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Frost, in Texas, Lone Star National Bank. You don't really see like West Coast City Bank or anything like that anymore. A lot of the small banks were basically brought into the larger companies.
They were like bought out?
Yes, because they couldn't survive on their own. But by being bought out, they had the support of the larger banks if there was like an economic downturn. So for a lot of them, it just made financial sense to get bought out by someone else. And unfortunately, every time the state tries to add an amendment that might expand the governor's powers or increase the state legislature's salary, the voters turn it down. They say, you know what, we don't want politicians having more power. We're okay with the status quo. And so every time they try, the public says nope. And so we have a limited government because the voters, for a lot of various reasons, just don't want an increase in government. Mm-hmm. In the off years, when they're in person, they make something like $35,000 to $40,000 for the legislative section. So they actually make a decent amount of money in session, but this year, yeah, they're only making $7,200, which if you can do the math is $600 a month pre-taxes. That's a lot less after taxes. The one benefit that's come out of these smaller banks being bought out is it is easier to transfer your account, right? If you have an account with Wells Fargo and you move from Texas to Minnesota, it's a lot easier to transfer your account up there versus going from one small bank to another. All right, in terms of education, in Article 7 of the Constitution, there was the creation of what's called the Permanent Education Fund, or the PEF. Unfortunately, this only exists to fund the UT and A&M systems. So there's something like $11 billion in the Permanent Education Fund that comes from the land, oil, things like that. So if you go to UTRGV or A&M Kingsville or something like that, there's more money because it's created from a permanent fund. Other state schools get money through the legislature and state property taxes. So it's why a school like ours is going to have a much smaller operating budget compared to UTRGV. We just don't have as much money guaranteed coming to us. And of course, there's been a shift in funding towards research and not so much in education. At a large school like UT Austin, faculty are required to publish a certain amount every year. If I were teaching there, I'd have to do a lot more research. So more money is going into things like cancer research, which is critical, of course, biomedical research, agricultural research, the less money for classrooms and personnel. So that's a little bit problematic because what ends up happening is you see a decrease in faculty and an increase in the size of the classrooms, where you get an intro to biology class where there's 100 people in an auditorium. And by and large, colleges and universities, especially the smaller ones, are relying on bonds and referendums through the local communities to increase their size. South Texas College has gone to the voters in Hidalgo and Starr counties and asked for a bond to increase the size of the college. And it's because of the bonds that the main campus has grown and that we have that new building here on campus for science and math. So the downside of that is if the voters don't approve it, there's just not as much money for these colleges and universities. We're too reliant on tuition, the funding we get from the legislature, and whatever we can collect in property taxes. So we have more of an issue compared to UT and A&M. You're guaranteed to have a little bit more stability in those systems, not so much outside of it. I'm going to get on my soapbox for a minute and say this. I really don't like the fact that we're shifting to demanding faculty do research rather than teaching. The purpose of faculty is to teach, right? You can hire researchers to do the research. Our primary job shouldn't be doing research, it should be teaching, right? If I was teaching somewhere where I was required to publish every year, it would be a lot harder to be in the classroom and be able to interact with everyone. So I don't like that shift in education, but it's been coming for a while, unfortunately.
I think my kids got two because two different colleges.
Mm-hmm.
And it's two different cultures.
Yeah.
Though it's one's UT and one's A&M.
Yeah.
It's different.
It is.
The UTSA
Mm-hmm.
is like 250 in the auditorium.
Yeah.
And the professor comes in, sits down, and I'm going to sit in the front.
Mm-hmm.
He comes in, he sits down, he puts it on the board.
Mm-hmm.
He goes for 30 minutes, he leaves, you have to stay.
Yeah.
My daughter's into Queensland. Smaller classes, but they do the same thing.
Yeah. I mean, you can't get to know your students at that point, right? There's no way you can memorize 250 names per section. Most of the time, the students are interacting with the TA, not the professor. I mean, I get it at the very large schools in some ways, but that's just not what I think academia should be. I'm old school. I like the idea of getting to know my students and having a smaller class size and, interacting with my students.
Beautiful campuses, but
Yeah. I mean, there are some smaller state schools that are like that. My undergrad alma mater, Western Illinois, is still very much a hands-on faculty, smaller kind of school, but it just depends. Okay. That's it for the lecture today. Next Monday, there's no class because it's Labor Day, so you guys don't have to be online or anything. There's nothing you have to do for next Monday because it's Labor Day. So next Wednesday, we will start on Chapter 3. So again, no class Monday. This is also for those of you online. And if you have any questions over the weekend, please feel free